political stability for the Spartan polis compared to other Greek states, which throughout the Archaic Age and Classic Age seem to have been in a state of more or less continual political upheaval and flux. So what are these reforms? Oops. Getting ahead of myself. Okay, well, because of the emphasis in the sources and subsequent scholarship of the idea that Spartans' #1 concern in revamping their society was making sure that they were prepared to keep their slaves subjugated, it's often thought that the aims of the reforms was to, in effect, create a system of measures to create a warrior class of all Spartan citizens. Although I put warrior class in air quotes because this is very much a normative view in scholarship that has come under serious challenge in more recent scholarships for reasons we don't have time to go into in an introductory course. But if you want to know more, do take the Spartan course because it's interesting stuff. And incidentally, this is a caveat that you should be aware of throughout this course, not just regarding Sparta, but regarding the ancient Greeks and Romans in general, because I put the stress on the word introduction in this course. So there's nothing that I introduced to you that we couldn't go much, much deeper into. But that's why these kind of courses are great, right? You get to learn a little bit about a lot of stuff, and then hopefully you will find the areas that interest you and get to dig in deeper if you go on to take future courses at a more advanced level. But back to the reforms. So you can see as much as it may have necessitated the restructuring of the Spartans' lives, the conquest of Messenia also facilitated this kind of restructuring. Because after Messenia is subjugated, you have the Helots working to provide for basically all of Spartans' essential economic needs. And then the Spartans were able to devote themselves not to farming the land and making a living, but instead becoming a society of professional citizens, which is really a more accurate way to look at it than a society of professional soldiers. Even though it is the common view to view Spartan society as a society of professional warriors, because being a warrior was actually only one part of what it meant to be a Spartan citizen. And essentially the reforms were geared towards enabling Spartans to have great leisure time so that they could devote themselves to the business of the polis and what it meant to be a Spartan, which would encompass many things, which we will now discuss. Let's start out with Spartan education. So a system of public education was set up for citizen males, that is those from the 5 Spartan villages which synoicized to form the city of Sparta. This education is called the paideia or agoge, and even though agoge is the later term used, kind of like Laconia is the later term for the region that has Sparta in it, when you read scholarship, agoge is the term you will most often see. But do keep in mind that when they're talking about the Spartan paideia or the Spartan agoge or the Spartan system of education or training, this is all the same thing. Right, so boys were enrolled in this formal sort of polis-sponsored education at the age of 7. The education included strenuous physical training and punishment for deviation from the rules. Formal socialization or training in the values which Sparta wished to instill in her men was a very important part of this training, and it concentrated heavily on instilling the qualities of these 3 important terms: eidos, shame; pytho, obedience; and enkratia, which is endurance or self-control, but with an emphasis on physical endurance. And these are really important qualities which Sparta sought to encourage in the boys through the education system. And incidentally, one of the most striking aspects of the Spartan education system in the opinions of our ancient authors who were writing about it is that the polis took control over the education of boys. You see, typically being educated in ancient Greece was a privilege of the wealthy, and in most families, in most polis rather, individual families would either hire tutors or send their sons to sort of private academies to be educated, and this was done entirely at the discretion of individual fathers. So any kind of standardized or polis-sponsored education system that was open to all members of the citizen class, regardless of their wealth, was pretty much unheard of in the ancient Greek world. And whereas there were mixed opinions regarding exactly the qualities that Sparta sought to instill in the boys and exactly the subjects Sparta taught the boys, the general consensus amongst ancient political thinkers is that it was in fact a good thing that the state be interested in the process of education. So I mentioned the specifics of the reforms that Sparta undertook. Successful completion of the education citizen meant that the child could join the ranks of full Spartan citizens, or the homoioi, which you will see often in scholarship translated as equals. This is incorrect. A more accurate and literal definition of the term homoioi is similars, those who are alike, but not equal. That is important. Indeed, the picture the sources paint of Spartan society is not one of equality, but rather one that is very, very competitive. And there are, in fact, many inequalities amongst members of the homoioi. But for those who managed to become Spartan citizens, became members of the homoioi, there are a number of reforms and features of citizen life that were the same for all. These are listed on your slide, the features of the so-called Great Retra, which is the name given to those series of reforms attributed to the lawgiver figure Lycurgus. So no Spartan citizen was allowed to practice any manual art or economic profession, whether that's being a baker, an artisan, a craftsperson, a merchant, a farmer. All these kind of things were left to the perioikoi, or in the case of farming, to the helots, who were required to provide a portion of their produce to their Spartan masters. Instead, what a citizen of Sparta was to do with his time was to keep himself fit for war and make the business of being an active citizen of Sparta his primary concern. And this is likely one of the reasons we have so few Spartan sources, since being a professional poet or historian or orator would have been considered to be amongst these banned professions. As citizen men were also forbidden from dining at home or with companions of the same age. Rather, adult male Spartans ate at a special mixed-age mess halls in groups of about 15, which incidentally comprised the smallest units of the Spartan army. So you can see that it's thought that you would dine with the people whom you would be fighting with most closely, and this would ideally create bonds between people who would be stationed close together on a fighting line. Now, these mess groups were called Syssidia, or Syssidion in the singular. And so Spartan men all had to contribute set amounts of food to the combined mess in the Syssidia from the land which the helots worked for them. And if they were not able to do this for one reason or another, for example, if they were poor, if their land did not yield enough produce to pay their mess dues, this could mean being expelled from the Syssidia, and then because you had to be a member of a Syssidion to be a Spartan citizen, you could in fact lose your citizen status. And at all times, everyone was under strict supervision to conform to strict behavioral codes, which applied to both boys and adult men, which leads to this sort of hyper-competitive environment where there's this sense of constant observation in terms of how you perform in public within Spartan society. For instance, Xenophon tells us that Lycurgus made cowardice the greatest crime in Sparta, and punishment for Spartan cowardice included all kinds of exclusion from society at large. And this for him provides justification for why Spartans were known for fighting to the death in battle rather than surrendering, because death would be preferable to the contemptible life that the coward lived in Sparta. Although I should note note that it's not going to be until after the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC and the legendary stand to the death that was undertaken by the 300 Spartans there that this belief about Spartans, never surrendering but always fighting to the death became prominent in the sort of mindset of the Greeks at large. And this is when the Spartans gained their most mythical status as warriors. And in ways that we will discuss in future lectures, in this respect, the Spartans actually kind of become the victims of their own reputation, because once they have this reputation, there is pressure to live up to it and consequences for failure to do so. But since Xenophon is writing after Thermopylae, we should be aware that this view that's expressed by him is probably reflective of Sparta's later reputation than it was of the early reforms that took place in the Archaic age. I'm going to talk about Spartan women. So Spartan measures regarding education and a regimented way of life also extended to the rearing and status of women. Spartan females seem to undergo an education process of their own, although this is not well documented by their sources, because presumably it was of less interest to the men who were writing at the time. But we do know that Spartan women were in fact given physical education, which was actually quite unusual in ancient Greece. This measure, along with several others that were purportedly put into place, such as similar to how the Spartan men were freed from farming by the labor of helots, Spartan women were freed from housework and weaving by the work of helot servants. And they were free to devote themselves to being Spartan women, presumably. They were married later than their contemporaries. For instance, a Spartan woman would marry at around 18 to 20 compared to 12 or 13, which was not uncommon in Athens. And in fact, supposedly they were fed more than women elsewhere. And all these measures were particularly aimed at ensuring that Spartan women would in fact bear strong children. So because of these features and others, such as, for instance, that the modesty codes women were subjected to were more relaxed in Sparta than in other polis, which you can see here in these depictions. You have these little bronze figurines of a Spartan woman in an exercising garment, which is both quite short and bears the breast. In fact, a nickname or perhaps slur for Spartan women amongst some sources was that they were known as thigh flashers, because they wore these short garments that would expose their thigh as they run. And particularly Spartan women were known to do this dance, which is sort of lampooned in Aristophanes' Lysistrata, where they were known to jump up in the air and touch their buttocks with their heels, and this is an display of physicality, but also apparently quite provocative to watch. And also another feature that marks Spartan women out from women elsewhere in Greece is that, unlike in many Greek polis, women in Sparta did in fact inherit land from their fathers as dowries along with their brothers, although the portion for a daughter was half as much as the portion for a son. So because of these features, where we can see Spartan women as somewhat more liberated, if you will, than women elsewhere in Greece, it's often suggested that Spartan women were in fact more liberated than other Greek women. And some, such as one of the authors of your textbook, would even go as far as to call Spartan women proto-feminist, which is taking it a bit too far, because in fact the relative liberation of Spartan women did not extend to any kind of political participation, and definitely did not make them independent in any way we would consider the independence or emancipation or liberation of women. Sparta was still patriarchal in structure, and Spartan women were still under their fathers' and husbands' overall control. And this is not just in matters of land inheritance and political participation, but even in marital and sexual matters. For instance, Xenophon records apparently several measures and legislation which allowed men to essentially wife swap to produce strong or healthy children. And while Xenophon tells us that women were happy about this arrangement because it gave them charge of 2 households, there's no indication that women, in fact, had any right of refusal. So we should keep these things in mind before we call Spartan women liberated. Right. Political reforms. So politically, changes seem to have occurred as well with the assumption of these great retra, these reforms. Although, again, there's no consensus, whether ancient or modern, on when various reforms took place. As mentioned, Sparta had a hereditary dual kingship, and the mythical explanation of this is that these kings were the descendants of Heracles, and that there were 2 because at one point in time a Spartan queen gave birth to twins, and she wouldn't say which was the older twin. So when the Spartans asked the oracle of Delphi, the oracle essentially said, make them both kings, and that's the sort of mythical background to why Sparta has 2 kings. But in reality, we don't believe that these 2 ruling houses, which are called the Agiads and the Eurypontids, were in fact related in any real sense. Likely the real origins lie in the process of Senoicism and the battling of basileis of those 5 villages, which came together in the 8th century. So it's likely that early on, 2 of the kings emerged on top in the process of Senoicism. So rather than having created an oligarchy like we see in other states, instead you get a dual kingship. However, by the end of the Archaic period, and certainly by the Classical period, the power of the kings had largely diminished. Perhaps initially they held absolute power, but certainly by the Classical period, their power was greatly diminished, and their primary spheres seem to have been in matters of religion and also in matters of war. For instance, the primary role, or the role that gets the most press, if you will, is one of the Spartan kings was always in command of the combined Lacedaemonian army when it went on campaign. And the 2 houses also tended to provide a check of the power of one another due to their inherent rivalries. So there is also a council of elders, the Gerousia, which is the 3rd point. Sorry, that's a bit out of order. And the Gerousia has a membership of 30 in total. You have 28 men who are over the age of 60 and chosen from the Aristoi, that is the best men. And then you have the 2 kings who would sit on the council of elders regardless of their age, for a total of 30 members. And indeed, the only way a membership would open up is if somebody died, because that is a position that you would hold for life. So as mentioned, this body tended to be in the control of the wealthiest aristocratic families. The Gerousia had control over judicial matters and set the legislative business, which would be presented to the assembly. They wouldn't propose it, that would be the king or the ephor within the assembly itself, but they would do the legwork before that. And the assembly is the body of which all male Spartiates who were above the age of majority, that is the age of 30, could take a part in. And the assembly met to accept or reject proposals presented to it. They incidentally did not discuss or debate these proposals or introduce any kind of new legislation. They only voted by acclaim, which is in fact a applausometer. So what would happen is a proposal would be presented, debated by kings or ephors, and then they would say yay or nay, and they would say yay, and everyone would cheer, and they would say nay, and everyone who wanted nay would cheer, and so apparently enthusiasm did count in Sparta. So finally, we have the Ephoret, which is a board of 5 magistrates who were elected each year from the male citizens over 30. And this is perhaps the most powerful office in Sparta. They had very wide-ranging powers, both domestically and in terms of foreign policy. They had powers involving supervising the kings. For instance, when a king would go on campaign, 2 of the ephors would accompany him to oversee him and make sure he behaved himself. Ephors could indict any citizen on the spot. They controlled the education of the young, and they seem to have been in charge of the crypteia if and when it formed. And they did have to account for themselves at the end of their year in office, which is a slight check on their wide-ranging power, because presumably if there wasn't any accountability, they could just run rampant. Indeed, part of the reason why the Ephors could only hold power for a year and not be reelected is because the power of the ephorate was so vast that you don't want anyone sitting on that board too long and establishing any kind of tyrannical power. And so by our modern terms, we would consider that this system, which was known in antiquity as a mixed constitution, is very much dominated by the elements of oligarchy or aristocracy, because by modern standards, it doesn't appear very democratic at all. However, ancient philosophers tended to view the system as a mixed constitution, which contained elements of monarchy or diarchy, since it was a dual kingship, which is represented by the king, oligarchy or aristocracy, which is represented by the Gerousia, and democracy, which is seen as represented by the ephorate and the assembly, because incidentally, the ephors could be chosen from anyone in the citizen body, not just from amongst the aristocratic or elite families within the citizen body. And actually, our sources tend to believe that it was this mixture of elements within the Spartan constitution that provided checks and balances and avoided anyone from getting too much or too little power, which allowed Sparta to remain as stable as it did for as long as it did. So in terms of Spartans' progression throughout the 6th century, the Spartans did continue to be aggressive through the 6th century BC and did try to gain further territory to the north of them, which is covered in Herodotus' history. And they turned next to the region of Arcadia. I had a slight issue with my slides, but now we're back on track. So one possible impetus for the continuing sort of aggression throughout the 6th century is possibly because many of the Messenians fled to Arcadia. You can see here on the map that Messenia is right here and Arcadia is the region just to the north, so it would have been a natural place to go. So in the middle of the 6th century, around 550 BC, the Spartans do succeed in defeating a polis called Tegea. But instead of enslaving the Tegeans, they in fact decide to enter into an alliance with them. And as a result of this, this starts to create a sort of buffer zone of allied states to the north of Laconia. Tegea wasn't on this map, but I made a little arrow right here. You can see it. And this is thought by some of our sources to have started a pattern of Spartan alliances, which would come to form what is called the Peloponnesian League in modern scholarship. Because over the course of the next 50 years or so, more and more alliances were made between Sparta and the states to the north of the Spartan polis. But they were never made on entirely equal terms. In fact, Sparta would be the dominant partner in these alliances. For instance, allies swore to have the same friends and enemies as Sparta and to follow the Spartans wherever they might lead, whereas the Spartans did not swear the same back, although they would protect an ally from a third party or a non-league member who was attacking them. And the allies were in fact obliged to provide troops or money to Sparta in times of need, although Sparta did not regularly collect tribute, which will become important later. Sparta acted as the hegemon of this group, a sort of leader of the group, but it was a very loose association, which will become important when we compare Sparta as the head of the Peloponnesian League versus Athens as the head of an empire, which we will discuss quite shortly. But it's important to note, because of the looseness of the association, and the sort of less formal power Sparta held in its alliances, Sparta didn't always get their way with the League. They might summon their assembly and present rather than impose a proposal to the League, which was voted on, and allies, presumably according to our sources, could in fact vote against a proposal, even if perhaps it was frowned upon to do so. And in the event of a war, Sparta would lead the army of its allies. Right. And in general, Sparta was happy enough of this. She didn't try to exert absolute control over her allies, but was pretty much happy as long as they agreed to aid Sparta in the event of Helot uprising, and were more or less content to follow Sparta militarily. However, one thing to keep in mind is that Sparta really liked oligarchies, and she encouraged the allied states to develop or adopt oligarchic governments. Sparta did not like either democracy or tyranny amongst her allies, and because of this, Sparta gained a reputation of being tyrannicides, or people who put down tyrannies, and this actually made Sparta have quite a good reputation in the minds of many, due to the sort of ambivalence with which many of the Greeks viewed tyranny. So even though Sparta was pursuing its own interest of creating friendly states with friendly forms of government, they got sort of this reputation as being, these champion of the oppressed and the ones who are going to put down these tyrants, which will become an important part of the propaganda involved when Sparta enters into the Peloponnesian War. And as I mentioned, this is a benefit to Sparta, because what ends up happening is Sparta essentially forms this buffer zone of friendly territories around the Spartan-controlled territories of Laconia and Messenia, which could be relied upon to aid Sparta in its subjugation of its controlled regions and provide allies in the event of war. And you can see that by the eve of the Peloponnesian War, which we'll discuss in future lectures, the Peloponnesian League and allied states friendly to Sparta extended not only throughout the Peloponnese, but also up into Megara and even into the region of Boeotia, up here, up to the north of Attica and Athens. So yes, Sparta became quite influential, both in the territory she controlled and in the allies over which she had influence. Now, there's a lot more to say about Sparta, but unfortunately we do not have time to say it now. But that will be it for today.